How does life continue when bombs fall every single night on your city? When the sky itself becomes an enemy, and sleep feels like a dangerous luxury that could cost you everything. This was the reality for millions of civilians in London during the Blitz, a period when survival was no longer a distant concern but a constant, suffocating presence that shaped every decision, every movement, and every heartbeat. Beginning in September 1940, the German Luftwaffe launched a relentless bombing campaign against the British capital, transforming London into a battlefield without front lines, where ordinary men, women, and children became unwilling participants in a war that reached directly into their homes, their streets, and their minds. As darkness fell each evening, the city braced itself for the now familiar howl of air raid sirens, a sound that pierced the night and triggered an immediate, almost instinctive response. Lights out, windows blacked, doors slammed shut, and families rushing toward shelters with whatever they could carry, never knowing if they would return to find their homes standing or reduced to rubble. The Blitz was designed not only to destroy infrastructure, but to crush morale, to break the spirit of a population through exhaustion, fear, and psychological terror. Yet what unfolded in London was a complex, deeply human story of adaptation, resilience, and quiet defiance. Before the bombing began, life in London had already been reshaped by war, with rationing, blackouts, and the constant awareness that Europe was burning. But nothing could fully prepare civilians for the scale and intensity of the attacks that followed, night after night, week after week. As high-explosive bombs and incendiaries rained down on docks, factories, residential neighborhoods, and historic landmarks alike. Entire areas of the city were marked on maps as high-risk zones, with the East End suffering particularly heavy damage due to its proximity to industrial targets in the Thames docks. Yet no district was truly safe, as bombs fell unpredictably, turning familiar streets into landscapes of destruction within minutes. For civilians, survival quickly became a matter of routine rather than heroism, as people learned to read the sky, distinguish the sound of incoming bombers from anti-aircraft fire, and judge whether they had seconds or minutes to reach safety. Families slept fully dressed, shoes beside the bed, gas masks within arm's reach, while children were taught drills that replaced bedtime stories, learning where to run, how to stay silent, and how to wait in darkness without panic. Underground shelters and basements became second homes, while the London Underground itself transformed into a vast refuge, with thousands of people descending each night to sleep on platforms, stairwells, and tracks, wrapped in blankets, clutching personal belongings, and sharing an uneasy closeness with strangers who quickly became companions in survival. These subterranean spaces echoed with the sounds of crying children, whispered prayers, nervous laughter, and at times songs meant to drown out the explosions above, as people tried desperately to preserve a sense of normality in an environment defined by fear. The psychological toll of the Blitz was immense, as civilians lived in a constant state of anticipation, never fully at rest, never entirely safe, their nerves stretched thin by the uncertainty of each night. Yet many later described a strange emotional numbness, a coping mechanism that allowed them to function amid chaos. Evacuation became one of the most painful and defining experiences of the Blitz, as hundreds of thousands of children were sent away from a city to the countryside, often boarding trains with name tags pinned to their coats, carrying small suitcases filled with clothes and memories, while parents watched from platforms, uncertain if or when they would see their children again. For those who stayed behind, the absence of children was both a relief and a source of deep sorrow, as homes fell silent and the emotional weight of separation added to the strain of nightly bombings. Each morning after an air raid brought a moment of reckoning, as Londoners emerged from shelters to assess the damage, stepping over shattered glass, broken bricks, and smoldering ruins, scanning their surroundings to see what had survived and what had been lost. Some found their houses intact, while others stood in shock before piles of debris where their homes had once been, their possessions buried beneath rubble, their past erased in a single night. Yet even in the face of such loss, daily life resumed with remarkable determination, as buses began running through bombed streets, shops reopened with boarded-up windows, and people queued for food and work amid the wreckage, refusing to allow destruction to halt the rhythm of the city. Civil defense efforts played a crucial role in sustaining this fragile normality, with air raid wardens patrolling neighborhoods enforcing blackouts, guiding civilians to shelters, and offering reassurance in moments of panic, while volunteer firefighters and rescue teams worked tirelessly, often under bombardment, pulling survivors from collapsed buildings, extinguishing fires caused by incendiary bombs, and facing unimaginable danger with little more than basic equipment and sheer resolve. The government expanded shelter construction, reinforced public buildings, and distributed millions of gas masks, though many civilians doubted their effectiveness, relying instead on instinct, experience, and communal knowledge to stay alive. Over time, Londoners developed an acute awareness of their environment, learning which shelters offered the best protection, which streets were most vulnerable, and how to interpret the subtle differences between distant explosions and nearby impacts, skills born not from training, but from necessity. Despite the omnipresent fear, moments of humanity and connection flourished in unexpected ways, as strangers shared food, comforted one another, and formed bonds forged in shared danger, proving that even under relentless threat, people seek meaning and solidarity. The Blitz reshaped not only the physical landscape of London, but the emotional and psychological fabric of its people, embedding memories of loss, courage, and endurance that would last a lifetime. What the bombers failed to understand was that destruction alone could not erase identity, and that every morning Londoners returned to the streets, to their jobs, and to one another was a quiet declaration that the city would not surrender its soul. Life in London during the Blitz was a constant balancing act between fear and hope, routine and chaos, despair and resilience, where survival became an act of collective will, and the endurance of ordinary civilians emerged as one of the most powerful, if often overlooked, forces of the war. As the weeks turned into months, the Blitz ceased to feel like an emergency and instead became a grim routine, a relentless cycle that reshaped how Londoners perceive time, safety, and even life itself, because when danger is constant, the mind adapts in ways that would once have seemed impossible. Nights blurred together as sirens, explosions, and the distant drone of aircraft became the soundtrack of existence. And many civilians later recalled how silence itself became unsettling, a sign that something worse might be coming. Sleep was fragmented and shallow, often taken in short bursts between raids, and exhaustion became a shared condition across the city, affecting factory workers, office clerks, nurses, shopkeepers, and children alike. Yet despite this physical and mental strain, essential services continued to function, driven by a sense of duty and necessity that left little room for self-pity. Factories damaged by bombs resumed production within days, sometimes hours, as workers cleared debris and improvised repairs, knowing that their labor was directly tied to the nation's survival, while hospitals treated a constant influx of wounded civilians, often operating under blackout conditions, with limited supplies and staff stretched to their limits. The destruction of infrastructure brought new challenges to daily life. As water mains burst, electricity failed, and transportation networks were repeatedly disrupted, forcing Londoners to improvise, adapt, and rely on one another in ways that blurred the boundaries between strangers and neighbors. Fires caused by incendiary bombs posed one of the greatest threats, as thousands of small blazes could quickly merge into uncontrollable infernos. And volunteer firefighters, many of them ordinary citizens with minimal training, faced walls of flame, collapsing buildings, and exploding munitions as they fought to save homes, warehouses, and historic landmarks from complete destruction. The River Thames itself became both a target and a lifeline, its docks repeatedly bombed yet still vital for supplies, while its waters were used to fight fires and transport the injured, symbolizing the dual role of the city as both vulnerable and resilient. The psychological impact of witnessing death and destruction on such a scale was profound, particularly for children who grew up surrounded by ruins, funerals, and constant reminders of mortality. Yet many later described developing a maturity far beyond their years, shaped by responsibility, loss, and the need to remain composed in situations that would overwhelm most adults. Schools operated irregularly, often relocating classes to safer areas or underground spaces, and education itself took on a different tone, infused with lessons about survival, discipline, and national duty, as childhood innocence was gradually eroded by the realities of war. The government and media worked tirelessly to maintain morale, broadcasting speeches, music, and news updates intended to reassure the population and reinforce the idea that endurance itself was a form of victory, while posters and slogans appeared throughout the city, urging calm, vigilance, and unity in the face of danger. Yet beneath the public displays of confidence lay a more complex emotional reality, as fear, grief, and anger simmered just below the surface, expressed privately in moments of exhaustion, in tears shed in shelters, or in the quiet despair of returning to a destroyed home. Religion and spirituality gained renewed importance for many, as churches, despite being damaged or destroyed, continued to hold services whenever possible, offering a sense of continuity and meaning in a world that seemed increasingly unstable. At the same time, acts of small defiance emerged as powerful symbols of normalcy. From women wearing lipstick despite shortages to families insisting on shared meals, even when roofs were missing and windows shattered. Gestures that reaffirmed identity and humanity in the face of chaos. Maps of London were constantly updated to reflect bomb damage, revealing a city pockmarked by destruction. Yet these visual records also told a story of survival, showing areas rebuilt, reopened, and repopulate despite repeated attacks. The East End, often bearing the brunt of the raids, became a focal point for both suffering and solidarity, as working-class communities displayed remarkable cohesion, sharing resources, sheltering neighbors, and rebuilding together, challenging stereotypes and fostering a sense of collective pride. As the Blitz continued, many civilians developed an almost fatalistic acceptance of risk, understanding that survival was often a matter of chance, determined by where a bomb fell rather than personal choices. Yet this awareness did not lead to apathy, but rather to a sharpened appreciation for life, relationships, and fleeting moments of peace. Evenings without raids were celebrated quietly, while moments of humor, music, and conversation became essential coping mechanisms, allowing people to momentarily escape the oppressive weight of constant danger. Over time, the initial shock of destruction gave way to a deeper, more reflective resilience, as Londoners came to see themselves not merely as victims of war, but as active participants in a collective struggle defined by endurance rather than aggression. The Blitz ultimately failed to break the spirit it sought to crush, because while buildings could be reduced to rubble and streets could be scarred beyond recognition, the social fabric of the city proved far more resistant, woven together by shared experience, mutual support, and an unspoken agreement to endure whatever came next. When the intensity of the bombing finally eased, the physical scars left behind served as lasting reminders of the cost of survival. Yet they also stood as monuments to the countless ordinary individuals whose quiet courage sustained London through its darkest hours, demonstrating that the true strength of a city lies not in its structures, but in the resolve of the people who refuse to abandon it, even when the sky itself seems determined to tear it apart. In the months that followed the worst nights of the Blitz, the people of London carried within them a collective memory that could not be erased by the gradual return of quieter skies, because the experience had reshaped how they understood safety, loss, and survival in ways that would linger long after the bombs stopped falling. Many civilians spoke of a heightened awareness of sound, flinching at sudden noises, forever attuned to the distant hum of engines, while others described recurring dreams of collapsing buildings, sirens, and frantic searches for loved ones, signs of a psychological burden that would later be recognized as trauma, but at the time was simply endured in silence. The city itself bore witness to this transformation, as bomb sites became part of the urban landscape, fenced-off ruins standing beside functioning shops and homes, constant reminders of nights when entire neighborhoods had vanished in minutes. Reconstruction was slow and uneven, constrained by limited resources and the ongoing demands of the war, yet Londoners adapted once again, navigating streets that changed week by week, memorizing new paths around debris, and accepting disruption as a permanent feature of daily life. Social bonds forged in shelters and shared hardship often endured beyond the war, as people who had once been strangers found themselves connected by memories of survival, loss, and mutual dependence, relationships rooted not in choice, but in circumstance. For many, the Blitz had stripped away illusions of control, replacing them with a deeper understanding of vulnerability and interdependence, lessons learned not through ideology, but through lived experience. Children who had grown up during the raids entered adulthood carrying a perspective shaped by early exposure to danger and responsibility, often marked by resilience, pragmatism, and a quiet strength that reflected the environment in which they had matured. The cultural memory of the Blitz became a defining element of British identity, frequently invoked in later decades as a symbol of national endurance. Yet behind this narrative lay countless individual stories of grief, fear, and survival that resisted simple heroism. Families mourned those lost in raids, often without graves to visit, as bodies were buried beneath collapsed structures or consumed by fire, leaving absence rather than closure, while others lived with the guilt of survival, questioning why they had been spared when neighbors and friends had not. Despite these emotional scars, life pressed forward, driven by the same determination that had carried the city through its darkest nights, as people rebuilt homes, resumed careers, and raised families amid ruins that slowly gave way to new structures. The memory of shelter nights, of whispered conversations in darkness and shared cups of tea under flickering lights, remained vivid, symbols of humanity persisting under extreme pressure. The Blitz had revealed both the fragility and strength of civilian life in modern warfare, exposing the reality that wars are not confined to battlefield but are fought in kitchens, bedrooms, and streets, where ordinary people bear extraordinary burdens. In reflecting on life in London during the Blitz, what emerges most clearly is not a story of constant bravery or unbroken morale, but a complex portrait of endurance shaped by fear, adaptation, and the stubborn refusal to surrender to despair. It was a time when survival itself became an act of resistance, when continuing to work, to care for family, to laugh, and to hope in the face of destruction represented a quiet but powerful defiance against forces that sought to erase both the city and the spirit of its people. Through loss and uncertainty, London endured not because it was immune to fear, but because its civilians learned to live alongside it, carrying on with their lives under the shadow of war, proving that even when the world seems to collapse night after night, the human capacity for resilience can hold a city together, one ordinary day at a time. And as the war moved forward and attention gradually shifted to other fronts and battles, the experience of the Blitz remained etched into the collective consciousness of London, not as a single moment in history, but as a prolonged test of human endurance that redefined what it meant to live under constant threat. For those who survived, the memory of nights spent listening to bombs fall, of mornings spent counting losses, and of days spent rebuilding amid ruins became inseparable from their sense of self, shaping how they viewed peace, security, and the value of ordinary moments that had once been taken for granted. The Blitz revealed that civilian life in wartime is not marked by continuous heroism, but by persistence, routine, and the quiet courage required to face uncertainty without knowing when it will end. A courage found in small, almost invisible acts like returning to work after a night of terror, comforting a neighbor who has lost everything, or choosing to believe that tomorrow is still worth preparing for. London's survival was not the result of invulnerability, but of adaptability, of a population learning to live with fear rather than be ruled by it, and in doing so, demonstrating that resilience is not the absence of suffering, but the ability to continue despite it. The streets rebuilt after the war, the new buildings rising where ruins once stood, and the lives rebuilt after unimaginable loss all stand as silent witnesses to a period when the city was pushed to its limits and yet refused to disappear. Life in London during the Blitz reminds us that history is not only shaped by generals and battles, but by ordinary civilians whose endurance determines whether a society collapses or survives, and whose stories deserve to be remembered not as distant statistics, but as deeply human experiences that still speak to us today. If this story moved you, if it helped you see the war through the eyes of those who lived beneath the bombs rather than above the maps, then take a moment to support this channel by liking the video, subscribing for more deeply researched and immersive war histories, and sharing this story so that the voices of those who endured the Blitz are never forgotten. Because remembering their struggle is one way we ensure that their resilience continues to echo long after the sirens have faded.